Welcome to Mycoworks Talks. I'm your host, Xavier Gallego, VP of Brand and Marketing, and I'm delighted to take you with me on our journey to grow the future of materials. Thank you for tuning in. In this episode, we are talking with Phil Ross, co-founder here at Mycoworks. We will learn about a class that he took in 1990 about growing mushrooms, and how that changed and transformed his artistic and cooking practices. Also, we are going to discover how he documents and perceives nature and how he uses it for his art all the time, but also how that could be a solution for achieving sustainability. The ending of this episode, we will see his vision around space and how mycelia could play a good role into it. So stay tuned. It's a really exciting episode, and I hope you like it. Hi, I am here with Phil Ross, co-founder of Mycoworks. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Nice to be here, Xevi.
Yeah, nice to have you here. It's been an honor. We were prepping for this moment. We did a couple of episodes just trying to warm up and be able to be at the level that we need to be with you. So thank you so much for being here. And I'm really excited. I'm personally really excited.
I'm excited to be here too. This is fun.
So before we get into your background, where you're coming from, all the nice stuff, I want to ask you a question. And when was the first time that you heard the word mycelium?
I don't really remember. It's because I've had too much mycelium. It was more than likely Paul Stamets' book, Mycelium Running, which he came out with, I think it was the early 90s or something like that. And it might have even been in a textbook or something like that earlier than that. But that was probably my first one. I've assumed that this word has become more and more popular these days, and this was growing in my own mind. And I went and looked it up on, one of those things that shows you how much people are mentioning this word. And I was like, oh yeah, it's probably this huge steep curve that's been going up over the last decade. And it turns out it was a century ago, was when mycelium was at its peak. It was when they made the first antibiotics, and that's when the word entered into popular usage. So your grandparents knew the word mycelium. It was really, really typical because it was part of these miracle drugs. And
so sad that they are not here to tell me. I will definitely ask them.
They could have taught us better.
Yeah. Well, we forgot about it, and now it's back.
It was sort of surprising to me how, we rediscover mycelium every generation or so for these really fantastic things that they offer.
So let's go back to the day that you read the book and you found the word. What was the next thing that you did?
The next thing that I did, well, I went and I found a class to learn some of the basic skills for how to grow mushrooms. And that was at the San Francisco Mycological Society. They had what was called a cultivation committee, which was the people who like to grow the mushrooms, and they would teach those classes. And so that's I took a couple of those with the folks who were offering those, and they were very particular and weird. It was this person had a laboratory in their bedroom, and it was just this teeny little setup, not much bigger than a little stereo setup or something like that. And, from following these very particular kind of behaviors, having to clean really clearly and cut these things and measure all this stuff. And but in this teeny little laboratory, he was able to grow, tons and tons of these delicious edible mushrooms that he would sell to people in these cardboard boxes. It was kind of nuts.
I still remember what I felt when I visited you in the basement in San Francisco, in that beautiful space. And I was like, what is he doing? So I bet that you had the same feeling, but just studying it. So
I became that guy. It's I just remember when folks would come over to do any kind of maintenance, and they would like just be like, "Oh man, I don't know whatever is happening. We're not going to ask any questions. We're not going to tell anybody. It just doesn't. This does not look right.
Wow,
It just looks wrong."
and where were you at that moment? Like you went to do these classes, but were you a student? Were you working?
Oh well, no, I was working already. I was working as a chef, and that's I brought a lot of those skills with me. So as much as like this kind of laboratory level of precision for making stuff, that was like way outside of my experiences. I didn't have that, like I said, maybe a class or two in high school or something like that would do that. But this was like more than a decade later. And so in that time, I had become a chef, and you learn a lot about processing materials, and just even like the size of a cut of a piece of vegetable, it has to be very precise, and then how you cook it at a very particular temperature, and then how you mix it, or you further process that thing. All the steps you have to go through to make something into food were pretty similar to the ways you have to grow mushrooms. Like it was, you start with this thing, and you have to follow this very, it's like a very precise recipe. And so I was able to bring those things together, this knowledge of how to build stuff and just make things, put stuff together, building equipment or things like that, and then also cooking and like really thinking of the process steps that you have to do that. And so that is that kind of marriage between those two. And
so I imagine that your mind was doing like the connection between one world and the other, like the similarities between cooking and actually growing mushrooms or taking care of the mycelia.
Yeah, and there was also like, I went to an art school here in San Francisco, and there was this very activist kind of temperament to the San Francisco Art Institute. So like when students wanted to do something, they would just figure it out. Like, if they wanted to build a health clinic, they were like, we're going to figure out how to do that. And like, they would just kind of do it. Or like, if you wanted to build a machine, they'd be like, well, let's go find out how to do this.
Self-driven?
It's like before this DIY concept, it was like, we're just going to figure it out. And that was like, the kind of training you get as an art student is just like, you have an idea, you have limited resources, you have the people around you, that's, the knowledge base, and you got to somehow, like do whatever it is. So there was like that kind of thing of being like, okay, I don't have a laboratory, but I know how to cook, and I have access to these kind of tools, and maybe I can, just like alter them a little bit, and then I can turn it into mushroom growing tools, or I can take this knowledge of how to make a whipped dessert, that has to have a colloidal agent in it to keep like the peaks of the eggs just so, like as you're doing it. And so you could do the same thing when you're growing mushrooms, is like, oh, how can I get this foam to hold itself over a period of time? And that's the kind of just the material space you think about when you're cooking. You do think about it as a material, but it's more like, it has to exist for like an hour or a day or maybe even a couple of days, but not for like 20 years. So it's just like, but the basic principles are exactly the same.
So when you were a chef or working in a restaurant, were you looking at other chefs and folks that were doing things that are more in the intersection between cooking and...
I was interested. I saw it as like a cultural passageway. Like you could join up. If you had basic cooking skills, you could go and join any people in the world because they would appreciate just the mechanical skills that you have. Like, okay, I can peel a bag of carrots in 5 minutes, or something like that. Like, okay, like great, you're loved everywhere on the planet, like good, go to work, that kind of thing. And so it was like, I was interested in like fine French cuisine, but I was also interested at that point in like vegetarian, which kind of went into, Indian food or Asian cultures or other stuff where there wasn't, there was more options. But then I was like, I like would cook with the Hare Krishnas for a while just because like I was like, this is a really interesting social situation. And, I didn't have to join the Hare Krishnas, but I could like hang out with them for 2 weeks and just cook with them. And they were like, great, come along, help us cook, and then you just sort of like...
And all of this is happening in the West Coast. So you're originally from the East Coast.
It was all around the world. This is the thing, like you can travel anywhere if you can cook. So it was just like, I would work sometimes on the East Coast, sometimes here. I would, sometimes like work for 6 months, save all my money, then go travel while cooking. So, go to resorts or places like that so you could travel and, meet people in other places and just, again, like be welcome. Be like, I'm going to come to, your education center and I'm going to work in the kitchen 6 hours a day and then just take classes or, just stuff like that. So it was like really cooking was my passport and just a way to experience a lot of stuff and really diverse kinds of food. And that was the thing. It was like, for me, it was like, there was no right or wrong. It was just like, it was all really interesting. Like, the Hare Krishnas pour a ton of pure white sugar into like, into these like amazing vegetable stews just because they have this ecstatic dancing. It was like, okay, this is like a whole other prerogative for your diet.
I mean, you probably discover a lot of things. And actually, it's a good way to discover cultures, to get familiar with other people, and to build connection, to be honest.
Yes.
So when was that, I bet that it was like over time that you were transitioning between cooking and art, or was it like seamless, or did you actually realize that something was happening where like that it's no more cooking, it's more art?
Yeah, it just kind of all melted together, and then it kind of got out of control. It was like,
when was the moment?
It was like, I think it was like when I was preparing for this art show and I was growing mushrooms, and like I was like, I need like 2,000 gallons, this is like, I don't know, like that's like 8,000 liters of mushrooms. And I was like, well, my studio is full, so I'll just like fill up my house. And it was like every single, it was like some cartoon, like every time you'd open up like a cupboard, there'd just be like mushrooms like under the bed, in the closet. It was like the whole house was just like
the smell,
wall to wall. And, like people come, and I was like, I just got to get this thing done. I, got this art deadline, going to do this. And like people would come over and you'd be like, oh man, this is like, I don't know what's going on with your house. And you're like, all right, this is just taken over. It's crossed over. And, the mushrooms became the art, and then the cooking became the mushrooms. And then, it's just all like sort of like.
So what was that art show? Like, what did you end up doing? Or did you just open your house and let people get in and discover the world?
I don't know.
Mushrooms?
I mean, I kind of gave over to a life of rot. I don't know how to describe it. It's like you allow, it's like growing plants. I mean, like, how much do you grow a plant? You help the plant to live by providing it with the things you need. And so it was like, how do you give over to accepting this thing into your life? And I was like, I'm just going to give over to this process of things happening over time that are out of control. And all I can do is like,
definitely out of control.
No, it is. But then it was like, what I had to do was very certain and specific in some ways. Like, even though like I didn't know what was eventually going to happen, I was like, I need to maintain like this cleanliness in my house, or I need to turn the temperature like that. It was like these very simple things that I could do, where I was like, I can do this part. This is like easy in my schedule. But then the artwork would just like continue to grow and do this thing. So like you didn't know what it was going to end up as. And then that was, I think, a really, it's hard to do that in any part of your life, is like to give up control. So it was just like, it was by design. And now a lot of my projects continue like that. It's like the basic premise is set up, and then by the time it ultimately manifests, like it's so different and it has a life of its own. And it's, Mycoworks is like that. Like it grew into this gigantic thing, and that was not the idea, but it just sort of happened because that's what it.
That was actually is a good analogy, I think. If you think about Mycoworks as one of your art projects, and you put the seed, and now it's like the house is out of control.
Grew out of control.
Hopefully, it smells a little bit better, but still, like, out of control. Yeah. So you started doing art projects, mycelium or mushrooms. They were becoming more and more the center of it. Like also, like you were trying to showcase nature or different angle on how like things grow and live. Like, when was the moment that mycelia became more of a thing and not nature in general?
I don't know. It didn't. It did not. When Mycoworks started, I've grown like oyster colonies before. I've designed a lot of gardens. I've worked with a lot of other kind of processes. I've curated museum shows and galleries and salons and continued to do all that stuff. So the mushrooms were always there just as like a thing. I've been doing mushroom stuff for almost 20 years. And then I really started to focus more on creating scenarios with people, like how to look at microscopes or how to build your own tools or just all this other stuff. But there's still just mushrooms happening in the background. And then, it came to this thing. I was like, I think it's time to build a mushroom house. I really wanted to grow a mushroom tea house. And then setting down that path, a funny thing happened on the way to the market. In creating something real, like it had been in this deeply metaphoric, symbolic realm. But as soon as it went to something practical like a house, then it just coagulated in a lot of people's brains as to the utility of this material. And that just sort of like, I think, set up a chain reaction of other entities approaching me and the folks I was working with to solve real world problems, which was just not
something you had in mind.
Not the focus. Even in growing a building, it was more like, I want to think about a temporary structure that disappears by people using, it was like a continuation. I was like, by the fact of people visiting the structure, it will disappear, like that it will cease to exist. And that was like the problem I wanted to solve. If you call that a problem, It was just more of like a concept of what medicine might be, which is like a gathering of people. And, that was under the premise of coming to an architecture, and that the architecture itself was the medicine you would drink, and then it would disappear. And then, but then I was like, oh yeah, but could IKEA use this? Could Ford use this? And I was like, oh, I guess so.
So when all these companies were asking you things, and if things were possible, I imagine they were like throwing you briefs and say like, hey, Phil, like, is this possible? What was your process? Like, were you just getting the brief and say like, I'm going to try this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this was, again, part of like what I was trying to resolve while I was studying these things for so long was how they reacted to their environment. And that to me was, how I came to know them was by looking at all these subtleties of how they would react to their natural environment out in the forest. And they're incredibly sensitive and plastic and responsive in that way. And so like you could tell so much about the way they had lived if you could understand and decipher them in the woods. And for me, it was like they look like a weird kind of gross, mushy thing. It's like it's hard to read it, and it's hard to appreciate its beauty because it's like it's a little bit challenging. It's a little bit ugly or grotesque, to people's first experience with this. And so I was like really interested in how I could evoke the appearance of it by altering its environment. And so to me, it was like writing in my knowledge into that if I wanted a particular outcome. So when these companies were coming to me and said, could you do this? I was really still thinking of it aesthetically, like how would I get it to look this way? What are the things I would have to do with this environment to do that? And so it was like trying to solve an art problem. Like, how would you make this look happier? How would you make this character? I was like, oh, okay, well, I have to do this, this, and this. So that was just my own personal language I had attached to this technical process. But again, it wasn't to solve anything. It was more just to understand how to grow it in the interior, inside of a laboratory to look like these things out in nature. And so that it was like a form of, writing and reading. And to me, it was like someone comes like, how would you do this? And I just would think like, oh, how would I write that out? And then that just kind of leads me to to thinking about the organism.
Really, really powerful, because I think that's kind of what makes us unique, right? Like we started with aesthetics first, and that more or less it was the foundation of this company, and now yes, we added a lot of like other legs, and it's a piece,
yes,
right?
It keeps on growing. Yeah, it's I mean, like this is like maybe the more mystical. I think a lot of people think about technical problems scientistically, like as if there's a scientific answer. And with this organism, there's so much we don't understand. So you just have to accept. You don't know why. But it does the thing you want it to do. So, like, who cares? And then, like, but that brought, like, we're going to resolve that. And now we have all these people who are, like, really eager to figure out, like, why. Yeah. But it's not the most important thing. And, like, you have to accept the mystery.
They might not be as relaxed as you are. They want to know. They have to write it down. And there might be 10,000 steps,
That's why it's, I think a beautiful thing is the marriage between that of the scientific and the artistic. Because it's like, correct, you can still accept, the profundity of the outcome without, you just accept the mystery. And then it can be resolved. It doesn't have to be mysterious forever, but it's like you can still get it to do the things you want it to do. And that's how we've existed with most natural things. Like, why does corn provide for us? Well, that's a bit mysterious, but it does. But we don't, that's not for us to know, but we can provide it with the right things and to be more generous back to us. And so
But it's in our nature to try to figure out like how.
Yeah, we want to know why. We want to understand, and that's great.
We are scared of the unknown. I
Yeah.
see. So it's really interesting because I think like when you start working on Mycoworks, you can see that art and you can see the science and now manufacturing, and there's like so many branches, right? How do you feel about seeing Mycoworks at this level? Because it's still like we're growing, right?
We've grown.
And,
Yes.
and when I was coming to the podcast, I was thinking like we are an organism right now. We are mycelium because we're growing, we are moving, we are trying to find food, you know, like, and we're growing and growing. How do you see us?
You know, we're going to keep on growing. As you know, we're about to break ground on this new facility. I think today is the groundbreaking, actually, of down in the South United States. And that still is like a small step, even though it's like such a gigantic building and a big step for Mycoworks. But it's like, oh, wow, we have to have like over 100 of these factories to start to have, you know, it's like, so it's like, oh my God, it's just going to keep on growing. So, you know, again, of like this thing of like getting this thing that's going to grow and keep on growing, like I feel like it's out of control. That's great. That's what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to, you know, initially when we were discussing it, it was like, how do you rub the sticks together to make the smoke? And so like that was the first steps that we had to do. And now it's like it's well past that. The fire is consuming its build, you know, now it's about to burn up a whole giant building of like its energy. So it's like that, you know, like when you tend the fire, that's what you ultimately hope is like it's just going to go forth in the world and do all that. I think like this goes back to this question too. Like, you know, there's this book, Frankenstein. And it's a lot about this creation of this thing. And then the abandonment of the responsibility to that creation is the story. That's the allegory of it. It's not so much, you know, that this is a monster, but the monstrous thing is the abandonment of something you created and releasing into the world. But I think about that. So, I mean, like, this is the thing, like, you know, you're talking about these people out of control, but then there's this huge responsibility also in creating this living thing is like how it's going to roll out to the world and, you know, like what that's going to be like. And, you know, I think it's come out of these principles of like, we don't want to work with these chemicals. We don't want to have these kind of things and just around your house. You don't want to do that. And the same way of like, it was really interesting to work with these natural materials because I was like, oh, this is just like going out into the forest. And that's what I like to do. And those are the kind of materials I want to be around. And so it is this thing of like, how do we keep on tending this thing to bring this into the world so it keeps on growing and eventually just becomes part of the world. So that's kind of how I see it. It's like mushroom, it will just like, it'll keep on growing until it's a permanent fixture and be hard to get rid of.
I mean, I know you for a little bit now, and I still remember when we first met and we were talking about with the material, and we thought it was the best material in the world, right? Like 4 or 5 years ago, that was bananas. Like it was crazy, and we always thought about like our wild dreams were to launch products with it, and I couldn't talk to you after the Hermes launch. And I didn't see your face. I've heard that you were really excited when you saw the bag.
Yes.
But how do you feel about the most recent launch with like the hats and start seeing like the material being applied into objects? How does that make you feel?
Oh, it's so cool. I mean, it's stuff that I would like to wear. You know, it's like at that level. You know, I have a wallet somewhere on me. I think that I've had and I've always had like. First, it was like a teeny little pinky ring because that's all the material we had, and I would just I wore that, you know, until it was disintegrated. And then I had a phone cover, and now I have a wallet, you know, that I've been wear testing for the last 2 years or something like that. And you know, I was like, oh, someday I imagine maybe I'll have a jacket or. You know, I'm so excited to have like something too. I know,
like now it's possible not only for you,
I know. So I absolutely understand people's frustration, desires, interest, you know, in this because I have the same thing, and I was like, I would actually wear, you know, like it reminds me of a Kangol, you know, like one of his, like when I was growing up in New York in the '80s, that was like the hat. So I was like, oh my God. I gotta have it.
It's a good one. We have a few here in Mycoworks.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So
maybe you can just test it out.
And that's the thing. It's like it's so exciting now. The dream is eventually for it to be boring, you know. So it's like this is the time to really relish this because it's such a new thing in the world, and it's special because of that. But the dream is for it to be boring and where you don't even think about it. And so it's like, that's a really hard, talk about an abandonment. You're like, oh, this is like this beautiful, precious baby kind of thing. And then you're like, but someday, just don't want to even think about it. That,
like that day that everybody owns one, but they don't even know it.
Don't even know it. It's just like, that's just the material. It's just a material.
Yeah. Sometimes I like what you were saying about the scalability and the factory that we need 100, the journey, because it's a long journey to get here. And one thing that I always got from you is that we're doing something really difficult. And I remember you always bring me down because there are optimistics and realistics in this company, and you are realistic. And you always tell me no, this is going to be really difficult. It's difficult. It's going to take us a little bit. And I work on the marketing side of the business, and I see how impatient people are and how they want things now and why is this expensive and why we don't have more. And I'm like, well, you don't have more because there is no more. It's expensive because it's really rare. It resonated a lot to me when you brought that reality into the business, that this is really difficult. Take it easy. It's going to take a while. It's going to be a journey. So do you still enjoy the journey? Do you still think that it feels like we're moving?
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. I mean, we have 200 people now at Mycoworks. It's just
Do you know all the names?
No, are you kidding me? No. No. I'm bad with names enough. I hope to someday. But, and we're by in another year, we'll probably have 800. So that's just such a phenomenal, and even just looking at the footprint of this new facility, it's like 250,000 square feet or something akin to that. And, when we first were thinking about this, I think about 4 years back, I went back and visited a gigantic vegetable processing factory, which was the scale of what we're moving into. And even more than a decade back, I visited a gigantic mushroom factory down in Southern California that is the scale of it. So I was like, I have it in my head, So
the scale.
I knew this is part of the vision. It was like, okay, this is what we have to do. This is the requirement to do what we have to do is a facility this large. And I was just like, how do I,
it's hard to
process. I have a 20-year-old Mazda Civic. How do I think, this is a little outside of my scope of imagination at the moment, so how do I think about it in that way? Everything happens. This is what I tell people who are impatient. I say, everything happens at Mycoworks, just you don't know when it's going to happen. So it might, eventually we are going to do that crazy thing where, maybe we're going to, send stuff off to the moon and we're going to be making these color-changing, pink, shiny, bioelectric, things. Or you're going to have, just all this. But it's going to take a while to get all that stuff. And, it's the more people who show up, the more there's so many people who come to Mycoworks who are so excited to come and help us because they're thinking about that stuff, or they're the expert in that particular branch of engineering or chemistry or communications or, whatever it is. I know I'm just rambling a bit. When people ask me well, what can you do to join a place like Mycoworks? And I'm like, it doesn't matter. Whatever you're doing, we need help with that too, actually. We need accountants. We need all this stuff that doesn't require any knowledge of mycology at all. But those folks show up and they're really excited to be here and to help to make all that stuff happen.
Yeah. There's actually it must be really exciting to you. I see it over time too, because when I started, we were 10 or something like this. And to see folks that come in here and that's their dream job, right? It was a really good job to me. I love work where I'm working, but they're dying to work at Mycoworks. Yes. It's so exciting. It makes me believe in our mission. And
people want to help out. I mean, people want to help to figure out how to solve just the stuff that's out there. And, we're doing this very minor thing over here, in textiles and fashion and all that. And there's so much need everywhere for everything. But then to actually have a place and be we've got a plan. We're doing this thing and people are really excited about it. And then that just, I think, makes other people excited because, it's again, super talented engineers, all this kind of stuff, all these different fields who show up and they're like, I want to help you to do this thing. And I bring this expertise with me. And they just, are happy to contribute that as part of their job.
Maybe we'll see a rise on people applying to Mycoworks, everybody from everywhere. We have,
Come on down.
yeah, let's go.
We're
And also we
hiring.
need people in South Carolina. So maybe,
Yes, we do. And, I think we have people in Barcelona now.
Yeah,
Don't we? We have people in New
Guadalajara.
York,
Yeah.
Paris, Southern California. I think
Can you
we have a
imagine
bunch
that?
of offices opening all over the place. I
Yeah.
know, it's kind of bonkers.
Wow. Yeah, it is. It is. I wanted to ask you about, I have many, many questions, so probably you'll have to come back because we have
Sure.
limited time. But I wanted to ask you about like the evolution of the platform of Mycelium, right? Like when we started, where we are today, because we were talking about scalability, the scale of the facility of that we're building in South Carolina, but also like all the engineering that goes there. And it's not that we're growing mushrooms; we're growing like trays and highly controlled trays. That each one of them is a universe almost. What do you feel like when you took that? Mycelium, like the first artistic practices, and then it became this over-engineer technology with like 70 patents, or I don't even know what it is anymore.
The kind of artwork that I made required a lot of people with expertise's help. So every project was something different. So it might require like an electrical engineer or a glass blower or a furniture maker or something like that. And then I would work with all those kind of people to put together those skill sets and to figure out like how to actually, produce something. So the original thing was really just like a fascination with the organism. It is a lot like growing plants. Like you have to kill a lot of house plants to get a green thumb, or cause a lot of destruction. Like not be afraid, of what's going to happen, because that's how you learn. You have to learn what the organism needs from you. I think with the mushrooms, it was really just like observation for a really long time. Without, my training was as an artist also. So like my first tool for observing these was to draw them. Like I would just draw them every day. I would observe how they were changing. I would do watercolors. So I was picking up the nuances and like paying attention to those kind of colors. And that was a lesson that's so different from what the scientist is looking for. Because for me, it was just, I had to accept it all. There was no category, again, other than like the aesthetic ones. So that kind of study, even preceding all of that, was really just like trying to think about the organism, what it's doing, why it's doing it. And so then all of the technological things, like those are, that's a way that the techne, that is a way that human beings exert, sort of controls over the world, over any medium. And so it was the same thing with this. It was like, okay, you can bring it into this environment, this control environment, and then it's all these different things you can do to it. And a lot of that is just the same stuff that we do for ourselves. Like creating the environments that we like. Is it light enough? Is it warm enough? Is there water? Is there food? All these kinds. So that's like just thinking about what does the organism want? Or how do you also keep the organism from getting what it wants? There's other kind of things that you can do to push and pull. And, I'd studied bonsai, which has very similar principles, where you take a plant and you're kind of torturing it and taking it to this very extreme condition to keep it in this stunted form. And so like it shows your fidelity and your understanding, not necessarily to grow the biggest tree, but to grow a really sickly kind of tree and then keep it alive for 100 years. Like that requires like a really deep knowledge of all
using
these
the word
factors.
torture. I normally use domestication, but
torture is
pretty much is the same.
It's it's a control system, and we subject ourselves to these same things too. We're inside of a building right now. I see air ducts. There's light. There's all windows. There's all these kind of things going on that are making it so that we can have a good life and be, at our prime or something, or not subprime. And, we would probably have a very different reaction if the lights were cut off and the air was cut off.
There's one thing that resonated a lot, because you're saying about engineering and streamlining and finding processes, and your background on artistic practice and drawing and actually go into methods like watercolors to get the nuances of things. But I remember like talking to the Mycelium experts, the people in the room, and yes, there is like a lot of time, humidity, blah, 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 yada, yada. But there was like a sound, there was a smell, there was a color, you know? And it was really cool to hear like, no, I know it's good when it pops.
Yeah.
I know that it's good when the smell is like that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, cool, we still keep,
Yeah.
I mean, of course, like now it's more control. So we have We highly control the environment, but still like
it's a craft process also. I mean, it's the same thing of, it's, like pulling the weeds out at a certain time. Like there's these things you have to pay attention to, and it requires a certain behavior from you as like the part of that growth process. So,
Totally.
And that's the thing, like we did not start through instruments, and a lot of people, that's again, the scientific approach to engaging with living things is often with an instrument between you. And ours came from a craft, from a literal hands-on, like in the same way that you put your hands on plaster or hands on ceramics as an artist, like that is how I approached the mushrooms, was like, how do I mush this with my hands? And that tells you a huge, the feedback system of like the knowledge of your body. That's like complicated. You learn this while you're drawing. You learn, you have to like dance or any kind of thing like this, is like, okay, I have to trust the knowledge of my body to communicate with the rest of the world or to bring knowledge in. And, so it's like, we trust that at Mycoworks, and we try to we translate that back out to science.
I don't think that we have another choice.
No, we don't.
I'm having a blast, to be honest. I hope that people that are listening, they're also having a blast. And we have a few minutes more.
Sure.
We have two questions. One is more like another open question, which is like space, right? Like what's the role of mycelium or fungi into space? If we want to colonize, if we want to go to other planets.
Like outer space.
Yeah.
Outer space. Yeah. Well, I know that there's already a bunch of programs in effect. I think NASA is doing something to grow facilities on the moon and Mars. There's some advanced mission planning for that, as well as astronauts who are going to be going for any longer term space travel. They have to grow all of their own resources, which includes their food, their clothing, all their tools, all that kind of stuff. So that seems like a really great way for mushrooms to go there, because we will be growing something green that we have to eat, whether it's algae or some kind of plant or something like that. And there will be probably some biomass or materials which then the mushrooms can grow on. So it makes sense. I think that, like anybody who's imagining going to Mars, I know the people you have to talk to, and I know you're not talking to them already. So come and find me, because you're not going to get anywhere without the mushrooms. Yeah. And so there's like so I kind of think of that as like just a good way, again, of like thinking of like realistically about the world. I was like, no one's going to Mars until they figure out certain fungi. So that's just the reality. Like we're not going to be able to provision for ourselves. So it's kind of like the road to Mars leads through a fungus.
We will leave it like here, that's the only way.
My bullheadedness on the subject.
And normally I finish these conversations with a very simple question, but everybody has a different answer. It's like, I want to know what sustainability means to you.
Oh, boy, sustainability. I guess that would mean being able to provide in a way that can allow us to keep on providing. That there's something built into that. As much as some people imagine it's going to be just a biological or an environmental problem or, an aspect of capitalism, we just have to really think of like, how do we want to provision for ourselves? And the principle at Mycoworks is to think of the seventh generation. Like, how do we think that far into the future? And to me, it's like, well, then we have to get in line with certain biological principles, because that's the best stuff that we know out there that can last that long and can perpetuate in time. DNA is one of the longest perpetuating things in time that humans have found that can keep information from the past going forward. So there's a profound lesson in that. Like, if we want to perpetuate things further, we have to figure out some of the things that are around us in nature. And again, like going back to that reading and writing, like we have to learn to read it a lot better. And, so that's why it's a kind of a delicious challenge, because like it's there for us to read, but can we accept the wisdom that it's going to take to actually decipher it? And that's going to be a lot of realignment of the rest of the world. So as much as like it's, sustainability means something about technology, something about materials, but it also means like just also a lot of work that we have to do on our politics, on our civilization, and all this other stuff that needs a lot of work too.
A little scary, huh?
Yeah.
Well, Phil, thank you so much for your time. And I enjoyed this conversation a lot. And I hope that we can talk about more stuff
Yeah, that's fun.
soon. So be tuned because you will come back.
Yes.
Thank you so much for listening. And thanks, Phil.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed as much as I did hosting it. We are thrilled to have you with us in our journey. So if you want to learn more, please follow our Instagram page at Mycoworks for our latest news and more. This episode is being produced by Maddie Nathans, sound editing by Carney Ballardo, content editing by Chantal Otto.